Ihr seht gleich ein Video von jemandem, der sich in den ersten Minuten seines Films selbst vorstellt. Was er sagt, macht ihn als Ankläger gegen gewisse Kreise so glaubwürdig. Der Film ist ein absoluter Augenöffner. Ihr werdet danach nach meiner festen Überzeugung alles verstehen, was hier läuft. Und nach dem Film blenden wir jede Seite des Kapitels 4 meines neuen und letzten Buchs Die große Täuschung über John F. Kennedy ein, nutzt dann die Standbildfunktion. Mein nächstes Video wird bewusst erst in 2 Wochen erscheinen, damit ihr alle in Ruhe das hier sichten könnt und verarbeiten könnt. Das ist nämlich meine herzliche Bitte an euch alle. Donald Trump hat ja nun beschlossen, alle Dokumente zur Ermordung des US-Präsidenten John F. Kennedy binnen 45 Tage veröffentlichen zu lassen. Das hat er ja in der ersten Amtsperiode nicht gewagt. Naja. Aber zunächst, Tonbänder eines Interviews der Frau von John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, wurden 2011 veröffentlicht. Selbst die BBC berichtete 2011 und ich verlinke euch wieder alles, damit ihr es selbst überprüfen könnt, wie ich es ja auch in meinen Büchern Fremdbestimmt und die große Täuschung tue. Und Jackie sagte laut BBC über den Vizepräsidenten von JFK, Lyndon B. der ihm ja nach der Ermordung nachfolgte als US-Präsident, folgendes, ich zitiere die BBC. Kennedy war seinem Vizepräsidenten gegenüber verächtlich eingestellt, genauso wie Lyndon B. seinem Chef gegenüber verächtlich war. Jackie, also Kennedys Frau, kommentiert, dass JFK ihr gegenüber anmerkte, oh Gott, kannst du dir überhaupt vorstellen, was mit dem Land passieren würde, wenn Lyndon Präsident wäre? Er wurde Präsident nach John F. Kennedy. Und die gesamte Politik der USA gegenüber Israel änderte sich schlagartig und vollkommen. Was ihr aber selbst in einem absolut augenöffnenden Film nicht erfahrt: Lyndon B. war laut dem Artikel im Blog der The Times of Israel aus dem Jahr 2016 eindeutig was? Ich spreche es hier nicht aus. Ich blende nur den Artikel ein, verlinke ihn, lest es selbst. Ich spreche es nochmals nicht aus. Aber erklärt das vielleicht seine absolute Loyalität gegenüber einem anderen Land? Gegenüber einem ganz bestimmten Land? Es ist nur eine Frage. Nach der beabsichtigten Freigabe aller JFK-Dokumente binnen 45 Tage durch Donald Trump erschien gleich in der Daily Mail ein Artikel am 24. Januar 2025 wie bestellt. Die Überschrift lautet: Ein erschreckendes Pentagon-Dokument enthüllt den Grund, warum der tiefe Staat schon immer die Veröffentlichung der Akten über die Ermordung von John F. Kennedy befürchtet hat. Naja, und dann geht es um einen Plan des US-Generalstabs mit Vorgaukelung bestimmter Sachen, Flugzeugabstürze, Geiselnahmen, was auch immer, einen Krieg mit Kuba in den 60er Jahren vom Zaun zu brechen. Aber Leute, das ist doch ein ganz alter Hut. Auch dass Kennedy diesen Plan natürlich ablehnte. Daniele Ganser hat dankenswerterweise darüber schon viel gesagt. Und nur ein Satz in diesem Artikel, der wie bestellt wird, lautet dann: Eine Verschwörungstheorie im Zusammenhang mit der Ermordung von John F. Kennedy behauptet, er sei von Israel getötet worden, das angeblich den tiefen Staat der USA kontrolliert. Nur dieser eine Satz dazu, zu dieser Spur im gesamten Artikel. Es ist sicher nur eine Verschwörungstheorie. Die Dokumente sind hier alle längst veröffentlicht, ganz viele davon auch in meinem Buch. Das erschien vor Veröffentlichung des Films, den ich euch gleich zeige. Aber in den Medien im Westen werden sie völlig totgeschwiegen. In diesem Film, den wir euch gleich zeigen, werdet ihr mehr erfahren, auch über die Ermordung des schwedischen Vermittlers der Vereinten Nationen, Graf Bernadotte. Selbst der Deutschlandfunk stellte 2018 zu dieser Ermordung fest, dass 2 Männer in israelischen Uniformen ihn umbrachten. Und die Mörder kamen aus einer Gruppe, zu der auch der spätere israelische Ministerpräsident Yitzhak Shamir gehörte, aber nicht nur der. Alles 2018 im Deutschlandfunk, der dann auch schreibt: Die Täter wurden verhaftet und verurteilt, doch schon bald wieder entlassen und rehabilitiert. Mehr gleich dazu dem Film, und ich blende noch etwas aus dem Deutschlandfunk ein, denn in Israel wird Bernadotte heute totgeschwiegen, aus gutem Grund. Mich erschreckt, wie Donald Trump jetzt über die Räumung des gesamten Gazastreifens mit über 1,5, eigentlich ja sogar über 2 Millionen Menschen spricht. Sein neuer US-Verteidigungsminister vom Wunder des Aufbaus des dritten Tempels in Jerusalem fabulierte. Ich zeige dir den Videobeweis und nähere Ausführungen in dem Video neben mir dazu. Schaut euch jetzt bitte den gesamten folgenden Film an. Und Am Ende, wie gesagt, folgt jede Seite aus dem Kapitel 4 über JFK. In 2 Wochen folgt dann der zweite Teil dieses Films, der auch sehr, sehr spannend ist.
Palestine was hardly Britain's to give away, a young John F. Kennedy wrote in a 1939 letter to his father. He further remarked, "After all, the country has been Arabic for the last few hundred years."
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
To be in deception, to be in fear, to be deceived is a much worse place to be than to have some truth. Like it says in the Bible, the truth will set you free.
And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
Here's an Israeli confessing the truth.
Washington is Israel's most subservient colony.
The government's been taken over. The date I say it was concrete that there was a coup and we lost our government was November 22nd.
Yes.
The assassination of Kennedy.
I'm a former Zionist and a former Jew. Let's go on a journey together to uncover the truth.
I think Americans largely get it. They know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are.
On 9/11, why was this Israeli woman smiling?
Well, big catastrophe, and I'm Israeli, and I hope that now people understand what we have to deal with, the kind of people that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
This is World Trade Center 7, which wasn't even hit by an airplane on 9/11, free fell into its own footprint at the speed of gravity and was an obvious controlled demolition. One of Benjamin Netanyahu's closest friends, Larry Silverstein, a major Zionist financier of Israel who is deeply connected with numerous Israeli terrorist leaders such as Yitzhak Shamir and Ariel Sharon, leased the World Trade Center shortly before 9/11 for a mere $14 million. When the Twin Towers collapsed in controlled demolitions engineered by the Israeli Mossad, Silverstein worked through his buddy Elliot Spitzer, the pro-Israel Zionist governor of New York, to use an insurance scam that pocketed him a $4.5 billion windfall.
Elliot Spitzer, he got me the $4.5 billion. We got very, very lucky. It was very, very good for the family, very good for us, and we were very, very fortunate.
We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. The Israeli Mariv newspaper quoted Benjamin Netanyahu as saying in April 2008, he reportedly added that these events swung American public opinion in Israeli favor.
And I hope that now people understand what we have to deal with, the kind of people that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Israel's main strategic goal with Operation 911 was to spread panic and terrorize the public into hating Arabs and Muslims so that Americans would support perpetual Middle East wars on behalf of Israel. What's the truth about al-Qaeda, who was blamed for 9/11, and the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS? Both were created by Israel's Mossad and the CIA, who used them as puppets to deceive the public and fabricate phony justifications for U.S. wars, primarily to advance Israel's goal to create a Middle East empire.
From the Jordan River to the Middle East, that's all ours. It was promised to us. there's no Palestinian nation.
There's a fight between the good and the bad, the good and the evil.
We will bomb Shifa Hospital, all the hospitals, all the tunnels, and kill them all. It's about time. We are the center of the world now.
Here's former CIA Director and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo dancing with the Israeli army, apparently to celebrate the joint Israeli-U.S. genocide in Gaza. Israel has been planning the total genocide, expulsion, and subjugation of the Palestinian people for many years. In February 2008, Israeli General Monaten Haltedauer threatened Palestinians in Gaza with a bigger Holocaust. In 2017, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich unveiled Israel's blueprint to commit genocide against the Palestinians in the Decisive Plan, also known as the Subjugation Plan. When asked if he intended to slaughter entire Palestinian families, including women and children, Smotrich said, "In war, as in war."
Everyone knows that what happened in October 7th was an Israeli setup. Everyone knows.
What? Look at him smile.
It was an Israeli setup.
This is Israel's 9/11. This is Israel's 9/11.
Israel used its second 9/11, the October 7th, 2023 incident, as the justification to implement the Decisive Plan genocide of Palestinians that Smotrich publicly announced 6 years earlier.
All night I've been removing bodies from beneath the rubble, dead children. We pulled them from 3 locations.
And I would like to use the rest of my time to say how appalled I am that people are bringing up the Holocaust. Do not use other genocides to describe this one. I have been...
You've seen footage of
shredded children's bodies, and that's my taxpayer dollars. We're going to bomb those kids.
So I think we should kill them all, if that makes you feel better.
Washington is Israel's most subservient colony.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
JFK supported Palestinian refugee rights, opposed Israel's nuclear weapons program and expansionist war plans, and tried to force AIPAC to register as a foreign agent. From the moment he took office in January 1961,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God.
JFK made it crystal clear that nuclear weapon non-proliferation was a pillar of his presidency as part of his quest for global disarmament, the abolition of nuclear weapons and all weapons of war, and ending the capacity of all nations to wage war. His Zionist vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who was primarily loyal to Israel, did not share JFK's values.
I have already taken steps to coordinate and expand our disarmament effort and to make arms control a central goal of our national policy under my direction. The deadly arms race and the huge resources it absorbs have too long overshadowed all else we must do. We must prevent that arms racing from spreading to new nations, to new nuclear powers.
Not only was LBJ opposed to every aspect of JFK's peace and disarmament policies, Johnson in the 1940s had illegally shipped weapons in boxes marked Texas grapefruit to Zionist terrorist militias who ethnically cleansed the Palestinians in the 1948 Nakba. Neither JFK nor his brother and confidant, Robert Kennedy, wanted LBJ in the White House, as revealed by JFK's widow, Jackie Kennedy.
It was only months after her husband's assassination when a 34-year-old widow sat down to record more than 8 hours of recollections about her husband and his most private thoughts while they were still fresh. JFK and his brother Bobby on Lyndon Johnson, the new president.
Bobby told me this later, and I know Jack said it to me sometimes. He said, "Oh God, can you ever imagine what would happen to the country if Lyndon was president?" So many times he'd say it, or if there was ever a problem.
Lyndon Johnson was a pathological liar, as reported by Bobby Kennedy, who said, "LBJ lies all the time. I'm telling you, he just lies continually about everything. He lies even when he doesn't have to lie." Speaking of lies, by May of 1963, JFK was furious at Israel for lying to him constantly about their nuclear weapons program. Kennedy delivered a near ultimatum to Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion: allow meaningful American inspections of Israel's reactor in Dimona to prove it wasn't being used for nuclear weapons, or Israel would risk losing all American and Western support. Also, Ben-Gurion established his ambition to, quote, abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine, end quote, as far back as 1937, when Israel attempted to conquer the Gaza Strip and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, seize the Suez Canal, and overthrow Egypt's President Nasser, with help from Britain and France, in the 1956-57 Suez Crisis. President Eisenhower kicked Israel out of Egypt using boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Lyndon Johnson, the leader of the Senate in 1957, strongly opposed Eisenhower's sanctions against Israel, but President Eisenhower overruled him and told Israel to pound sand and withdraw. JFK, who was also a senator in 1957, did not rush to Israel's defense or attempt to undermine Eisenhower's sanctions against Israel the way LBJ had.
Thousands of Israelis demonstrate in Jerusalem against withdrawal from Gaza and Aqaba. Mr. Ben-Gurion, the premier, enters to announce the government's decision to the Knesset, Israel's parliament.
Nearly the entire world applauded the Eisenhower administration for compelling the Israeli aggressor to back off. The American ambassador in Egypt said, "The U.S. has suddenly emerged as a real champion of right." Eisenhower's handling of the crisis was a high point of his presidency. It upheld the authority and moral stance of the United Nations and the ideals of the United States. Israel learned an important lesson from this humiliating retreat. The only way Israel would be able to conquer and hold on to the West Bank, Gaza, and vast tracts of Egyptian and Syrian territory in the 1960s was by placing a Zionist puppet they could control in the White House. President Kennedy had a warm and cooperative relationship with Egypt's President Nasser, whom Ben-Gurion hysterically denounced as a would-be Hitler without any factual basis.
We want to be friendly to all the world. We want to participate in the case of peace. We want to cooperate with the world to avoid war. We have to defend our territory against aggression, and we insist about gaining the rights of the Arabs of Palestine, the 1 million refugees. We are insisting and we are calling to give the Palestine refugees their rights, their territory, and their land and their homes.
Overthrowing Egypt's President Nasser was one of Israel's numerous objectives that JFK opposed. Additionally, JFK was in sync with President Nasser in putting enormous diplomatic pressure on Israel's Ben-Gurion to allow hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes or be given the option of compensation and resettlement. This would have largely reversed Ben-Gurion's Plan Dalet, which Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, in which Ben-Gurion and other Zionist terrorist leaders masterminded the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, using terrorism and the mass slaughter of civilians to expel 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and destroy 530 Palestinian villages.
Palestinians who fled often carried only enough to stay away for a few weeks, hoping they'd eventually return home.
A lot of them locked their doors, put their key in their pocket, and then moved to safer ground. When you leave the house and you take your key with you, it's because you're planning to go home. In the case of the Palestinians, those refugees weren't allowed to return.
Refugees trying to return were often shot at. Zionist paramilitary operations also tried to prevent them from returning again by destroying the villages.
That act of preventing their return compounded the Nakba. So the Nakba is both the forcible displacement of Palestinians from their homes and lands and country, as well as preventing them to return once the fighting was over.
Palestinian society was dismembered, crushed. More than half of the Palestinian people became refugees, stateless, dispossessed of their land.
Over time, the State of Israel covered up the physical evidence of an Arab Palestine. Place names were often changed from Arabic ones to Hebrew ones. The Jewish National Fund embarked on a massive effort to plant thousands of acres of pine forests and recreational areas on top of hundreds of ruined Palestinian villages.
Even though these forests have now grown into big pine trees, Palestinians have not forgotten their homelands.
JFK's proposed return of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees would have upended Israel's violently engineered Zionist Jewish majority status. Prior to Ben-Gurion's Operation Dalet in 1948, Jews constituted only 1/3 of the population of historic Palestine, even after massive immigration from Europe over the prior decade. In 1947, Jews controlled only 7% of the land of Palestine before Zionist militias stole huge amounts of Palestinian land to create the State of Israel. Furthermore, JFK's refugee return would have de facto blocked Israel's long-game maximalist Middle East ambition to create a massive Greater Israel empire from the Euphrates River to the Nile River, what Zionist rabbis called the Promised Land, swallowing all of Palestine and Jordan, plus large chunks of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and all of Lebanon. Ben-Gurion utterly resisted JFK's Palestinian refugee return plan and wrote in the fall of 1962, quote, "Israel will fight against this implementation down to the last man," end quote. In fact, the Zionist Stern Gang terrorist leader Yitzhak Shamir, who later became the 7th Prime Minister of Israel, oversaw the assassination of UN peace mediator Count Volker Bernadotte in 1948, in large part because Bernadotte also, like JFK and President Nasser, wanted the Palestinian refugees to be able to return to their homes.
On the 17th of September 1948, Count Volker Bernadotte landed at Calandia Airport, north of Jerusalem. Heading towards the YMCA, the 3-car convoy was suddenly halted. An army jeep pulled out from a side street to block the road. 3 men in Israeli army fatigues sprang out of the jeep.
Then suddenly the Count opens the window of his car so he can see what's happening. Then they identify him, and Yehoshua Cohen goes to the car, puts his Schmeisser submachine gun in through the window, and unloads on everyone sitting in the rear seat.
By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Bernadotte lay dead in hospital. Politicians and diplomats representing their countries at the UN meeting in Paris came to Orly Airport to pay their last respects.
Following the Bernadotte slaying, Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion granted a general amnesty to all the guilty parties. He chose assassin Yehoshua Cohen to be his close friend and personal bodyguard at Kibbutz Sde Boker in the Negev. Ben-Gurion created and supervised the Mossad, and Yitzhak Shamir became the Mossad Director of Assassinations, a position Shamir held at the time of the JFK assassination in 1963. For Israel, the JFK assassination was the sequel to the Bernadotte assassination 15 years earlier. On top of everything else, JFK was livid at Israel's lobbyists in America, such as Abraham Feinberg and Isaiah Kennan, for shamelessly attempting to buy his entire Middle East foreign policy during the 1960 presidential campaign. He directed his Attorney General and brother RFK to register the American Zionist Council, the predecessor to AIPAC, as a foreign agent. An attorney who worked for Israel's lobbyists wrote that this effort would eventually destroy the entire Zionist movement. Had the Kennedy brothers' registration efforts succeeded, it likely would have resulted in the end of the State of Israel, because these same American Zionist lobbyists for Israel, such as Abraham Feinberg, would have been exposed for funding Israel's nuclear weapons project, contrary to JFK's entire foreign policy. Furthermore, Israel's agents in America were illegally and treasonously stealing nuclear weapons materials from the NUMEC Apollo uranium plant in Apollo, Pennsylvania, and smuggling them to Israel. Ryan Dawson reports in his documentary that the NUMEC nuclear holding company was a den of Zionists.
Their directors were Ivan J. Novick, a future Zionist Organization of America president, and David Lowenthal, a refugee smuggler for Israel who fought in the 1956 war.
The FBI has photographs of Lowenthal shaking hands with David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Dayan, Israel's military chief of staff from 1953 to 1958.
Lowenthal's partner was Dr. Zalman Shapiro, the president of NUMEC, and also the Zionist Organization of America chapter president of Pennsylvania.
The American Zionist Council was pumping out propaganda about every aspect of Israel's nuclear program to deceive the American public. These treasonous lobbyists who claimed to be Americans but were loyal to Israel lied and said Israel's nuclear reactor in Dimona was built for peaceful purposes and couldn't possibly produce a bomb. If the Kennedy brothers had succeeded in registering the American Zionist Council as a foreign agent, which would have subjected all their records and finances to federal scrutiny, the entire nuclear weapons theft operation would likely have been unmasked. And had JFK found out about it, he certainly would have ended all military and economic aid to Israel, as he threatened to do 3 times starting in May of 1963. Israel would likely have collapsed given its total dependency on American aid. Also, JFK might have asked the United Nations to rescind its 1949 vote that granted member state status to Israel. JFK might even have asked the UN to rescind its 1947 vote that partitioned Palestine like a crazy quilt and designated huge amounts of land to Zionist Jews who didn't even own that land.
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized.
No Arab state voted for the 1947 partition of Palestine.
The Arab delegates declare a boycott as the final roll call has begun.
In the face of total opposition from all Arab nations, including the Palestinians, the Zionist movement used bribery, threats, and even an assassination attempt against President Truman to pass the 1947 UN Partition of Palestine vote by the necessary 2/3 supermajority. The U.S. State Department had strenuously opposed the partition of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel, considering both to be contrary to American principles and U.S. interests, against indigenous Palestinian wishes, and a violation of democratic principles. The Joint Chiefs warned that the Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. U.S. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal said the partition plan and creation of Israel could endanger U.S. national security. Despite all this, U.S. President Harry Truman supported both the partition of Palestine and recognition of Israel. Yitzhak Shamir's terrorist Stern Gang attempted to assassinate Truman in the summer of 1947, a few months before the partition vote. Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret, disclosed this incident in her biography of her father. Yitzhak Shamir's Stern Gang mailed letter bombs to Truman and senior White House staff members that could have killed or maimed them. Although the Secret Service intercepted the letters, Truman got the message loud and clear. As a result of both this threat against his life and in an attempt to appease domestic Zionist Jewish voters and collect Zionist campaign funds, Truman both supported the 1947 partition vote and rushed to recognize Israeli statehood in 1948 against the objections of his diplomatic advisors.
We had several other people in the country, even among the Jews, the Zionists particularly, who were against anything that was to be done if they couldn't have the whole of Palestine and everything handed to them on a silver plate so they wouldn't have to do anything. It couldn't be done. We had to take it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million more and expect both sets of them to be pleased. We had all sorts of objections to everything that was done. Something had to be done. We went ahead and done it and had it done, and now it's working out. Eventually, I think we'll have them all satisfied, but it's going to take a great deal of time yet to get the job done.
In fact, it was Abraham Feinberg, the same treasonous lobbyist who later funded Israel's nuclear weapons program and tried to buy JFK's Middle East foreign policy, who would finance Truman's whistle-stop election campaign in 1948. Furthermore, the Zionist president of United Fruit Company, Samuel Zemurray, worked directly with future Israeli President Chaim Weizmann to flagrantly buy UN votes for the November 1947 partition plan. Zemurray asked each leader in the region 2 questions. How do you intend to vote on partition, and can your vote be changed? Zemurray told Weizmann that every vote from Mexico to Colombia was for sale. Zionists used every trick imaginable to pressure and cajole world leaders. Costa Rica's president, Jose Figueres, reportedly received a blank checkbook. Haiti was promised economic aid if it would change its original vote opposing partition. Zionist financier and longtime presidential advisor Bernard Baruch told France it would lose U.S. aid if it voted against partition. The wives of Latin American country delegates received mink coats. In the end, all the Zionist threats and bribery resulted in the UN passing the partition plan despite all Arab countries opposing it and with no support from the Palestinians who actually owned Palestine. Thus, the UN vote to partition Palestine was a Zionist-controlled political rubber stamp on the Zionist theft of Palestine. It wasn't a binding vote, just an advisory opinion, but it was used as an excuse to steal the country. Even David Ben-Gurion later admitted that the Zionists had stolen Palestine. Ben-Gurion said in a conversation with Zionist leader Nahum Goldman, quote, "Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true, but 2,000 years ago, and what is that to them? There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They, the Palestinians, only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that?" End quote. The atrocious historical crime of the partition of Palestine and the theft of the country would eventually have been called into question for JFK if he'd found out about the NUMEC Zionist nuclear weapons smuggling operation. One revelation would have led to more questions and more revelations of Zionist crimes. Had the public found out Israel was stealing nuclear weapons materials from the Pennsylvania plant, Israel at minimum would have been permanently exiled from American halls of power. Ben-Gurion's high hopes were very different than JFK's. In addition to acquiring nuclear weapons, conquering more territory in the Middle East, stopping the return of Palestinian refugees, and preventing AIPAC from being registered as a foreign agent, David Ben-Gurion had another major long-term goal for Israel that could never be accomplished with JFK in the way: the creation of a Jewish Zionist one-world government with Jerusalem as the global capital.
This scenario is borne out by none other than Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, one of the great founders of Israel. Recorded in an astonishing article in Look magazine, Ben-Gurion predicted that a one-world system presided over by Jerusalem will be set up in the near future. All continents will become united in a world alliance, at whose disposal will be an international police force. All armies will be abolished, and there will be no more war. In Jerusalem, the United Nations, a truly united nations, will build a shrine of the prophets to serve the federated union of all continents. This will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind, to settle all controversies among the federated continents, as prophesied by Isaiah.
While Ben-Gurion's goal was a Zionist peace in which Israel would conquer and rule the world, according to the Torah, or Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament, JFK's Christian faith and American ideals informed his vision of a very different kind of peace.
I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
The Kennedy presidency was an existential crisis for Israel on every conceivable level.
Let us move up the steep and difficult path towards comprehensive disarmament, securing mutual confidence through mutual verification, and building the institutions of peace as we dismantle the engines of war.
Israel's back was against the wall. For Israel to survive and achieve all its goals in the 1960s, JFK had to go.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
November 22nd, 1963, the CIA, Israel, Zionists, and a coalition of power elites overthrow the U.S. government. Co-opted Israeli agent James Jesus Angleton, the most powerful man at the CIA at the time, orchestrated the assassination of JFK and the cover-up on behalf of both former CIA Director Allen Dulles and Israel's founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Books such as JFK and the Unspeakable and The Devil's Chessboard name Angleton as a major player in the assassination. What neither book says is that CIA Deputy Director Robert Amory, one of the only honest CIA leaders with honor and integrity, correctly named Angleton to be a co-opted Israeli agent in October 1956. As revealed by another honest CIA agent, Crane Eveland, in his memoir Ropes of Sand, Israel held blackmail power over Allen Dulles, which ensured Angleton could get away with advancing Israel's entire agenda, including the illegal smuggling of nuclear weapons materials out of the U.S. Crane Eveland also says Angleton turned over most of the CIA's Middle East intelligence responsibilities to Israel. Angleton, pictured here with future Mossad Director Ephraim Halevi, coordinated CIA Mossad operations to cover the entire Middle East and Africa. Thus, the Mossad used their Zionist loyalist Angleton to execute a coup of the CIA and take over nearly the entire CIA in the 1950s, long before JFK took office. After Ben-Gurion resigned as Israel's prime minister on June 16, 1963, 5 months before the assassination, Halevi disclosed that Angleton met privately in person with Ben-Gurion to transact business at Ben-Gurion's home in Sde-Boker, Israel. With respect to U.S. relations with Israel, Angleton ran a shadow government within the CIA. Angleton's counterintelligence program was a CIA within the CIA, sealed from scrutiny and accountable to no one, yet supported by an almost unlimited budget. Angleton's Israeli partners worked closely with him to prepare for the Dallas coup. The Mossad's Yitzhak Shamir reportedly hired at least one of the JFK assassination team members through a French intelligence contact. The Mossad and Shamir's daughter confirmed Shamir was stationed in Paris during his tenure as director of assassinations.
חלק מהתקופה הזאת המשפחה נמצאת בפריז.
פריז הייתה מוקד של הפעילות המודיעין הישראלית באירופה.
אנחנו ידענו שאנחנו נוסעים לפריז כי אבא הוא עובד אל על.
Shamir ran the Cadone, the ultra-elite team known as the Mossad within the Mossad. Israeli press disclosed that the Mossad hired Adolf Hitler's #1 former commando, Otto Skorzeny, for ongoing assassination jobs starting in 1962. H.P. Albarelli reports Otto Skorzeny played a key role in the JFK assassination. Numerous Zionist fingerprints are found all over the Dallas coup and the cover-up. The leader of Israel's Operations Directorate and future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was in Dallas, Texas on the day of the JFK assassination, according to Rabin's widow. He was allegedly on a military briefing tour. 2 weeks after the assassination, Rabin was promoted to Chief of Staff of the Israeli military. The National Crime Syndicate, which was mostly Zionist and mostly Jewish, played a major role in the assassination. 2 different contacts who possess direct knowledge of the incident told me that organized crime boss and Zionist Jew Paul Dorfman angrily pushed Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy up against a concrete column at a Democratic fundraiser in San Francisco at the Sheraton Palace Hotel's Grand Court. Dorfman said to RFK, "Look, you son of a bitch, I put your brother in the White House, and I can take him out." In the weeks prior to the JFK assassination, Paul Dorfman's stepson Alan Dorfman paid off Jacob Leon Rubenstein, a.k.a. Jack Ruby, the Zionist Jewish mobster who was charged with shooting and killing Lee Oswald, Angleton's chosen scapegoat and patsy for the JFK assassination. A paraffin test showed that the entire case against Oswald was a big lie.
But I emphatically deny these charges. I'd like some legal representation, but these police officers have not allowed me to have any. I'm just a patsy.
Not only was Lee Oswald innocent of all charges, he loved President Kennedy and reportedly saved the president's life a few weeks before Dallas by warning about an earlier assassination attempt that was being set up in Chicago for November 2nd, 1963. Former Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden, who was loyal to JFK, is a living witness who testifies that this plot was funded by Israelis.
I do know that in October of 1963, there was another information that was gathered by the Secret Service informant in Chicago that said that the president was about to be assassinated and that it was a done deal, that the money had been put up by Israeli sources.
When Rabbi Hillel Silverman interviewed Jack Ruby in prison, Ruby said, "I did it for the Jewish people." Ruby was a strong supporter of Israel, had traveled to Israel, and had run guns illegally to Israel. The Dorfmans and Jack Ruby were underlings of Meyer Lansky, the Zionist Jewish chairman of the National Crime Syndicate and its infamous assassinations arm, Murder Incorporated. Lansky was the most powerful mobster in the U.S. He was the actual godfather. He played a crucial role running guns to Israel for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and he closely collaborated with CIA leadership on numerous operations, including drug trafficking and assassination plots against Fidel Castro. In 1970, Lansky fled to Israel to escape tax evasion charges. Another CIA agent who was a Zionist Jewish spy loyal to Israel, Reuben Efron, opened Oswald's mail on an ongoing basis before the assassination under Angleton's direction. Pro-Israel Zionist media such as the New York Times played a key role in disseminating Angleton's lone gunman lie, pinning the blame on Oswald.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, defend the Constitution of the United States.
They are the founders and rulers of the usurped states of Zionism and the Central Intelligence Agency. We have lived in the USZCIA empire of lies ever since.
the 6-day war in the Middle East between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria is underway. A spy ship, very lightly armed, but bristling with antennae, steams into the Mediterranean to eavesdrop on the conflict. With the war reaching its climax, Israeli jets and motor torpedo boats launch an unprovoked attack on the ship. They drop napalm and strafe its decks with rockets, cannon fire, and armor-piercing rounds before trying to sink it with torpedoes.
We had no way to defend ourselves, and we're just slaughtered.
And they shot up the life rafts that were put into the water, and they shot the ones that were still on board the ship.
Throughout the attack, the ship flies the Stars and Stripes, the flag of the United States of America. Its name, the USS Liberty, is freshly painted on its stern.
If the Israelis had succeeded in sinking the ship without leaving any witnesses or survivors, Egypt would have been accused of the crime and the United States would have been drawn into the war and sided with Israel.
In a presentation to surviving USS Liberty crewmen, journalist Peter Hougham reports the intended purpose of the Operation Cyanide false flag was to create an excuse and pretext to launch a joint Israeli-U.S. nuclear strike against Egypt. President Nasser of Egypt was squarely in Israel's crosshairs. Multiple countries were on a hair-trigger alert for a global nuclear war.
What happened to you guys on June the 8th, 1967 was actually a seminal moment in world history. And yet the true story has been buried by your government. And the reason is that what happened was so shaming, not just to Israel, but to America too. Only by a hair's breadth did the world avoid a nuclear exchange. The superpowers nearly led us into a Third World War. From late 1966 onwards, there were US military personnel, experts, stationed in Tel Aviv, helping with Operation Cyanide and planning for a forthcoming war against Egypt. In other words, it wasn't to defend Israel from an attack by Egypt. It was to promote an attack by Israel on Egypt. Their objective was to launch an invasion of Jordan and grab territory in the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem, which was considered historical areas of the Jews. By the time the Liberty reached its position close to the Egyptian coast, Israel had conquered the Sinai. Its troops were close to the Suez Canal. Underneath the Liberty, there was a Polaris submarine, the USS Andrew Jackson, which had followed your ship all the way from Spain. But remember, a submarine like that has only one purpose, and that is to strike against an enemy with nuclear weapons in the event of a nuclear war. As the attack unfolded and the Sixth Fleet got a message from the Liberty that you were being attacked, instead of sending planes to your rescue, they started a counterattack on Cairo. Nuclear-armed planes were dispatched from the USS America, a huge aircraft carrier, to bomb Cairo. So these planes, launched from the USS America, reached within 3 minutes of dropping these nuclear weapons on Cairo, with alert from several sources. They were well over Egyptian territory when an order came through for them to urgently return to base. A panic-stricken Robert McNamara and his president, Lyndon Johnson, came on the line and ordered the recall. Altogether, 50 planes were dispatched towards Egypt. And after their recall, every one had to be counted in. It is reminiscent of Dr. Strangelove. Added to this, a powerful amphibious landing force was dispatched to land near El Alamein, and you could only assume that they were due to head for Cairo too. When it had to be recalled, it was clear the mission was a fiasco. But of course, it was also an outrage, because Egypt had not conducted the attack on the Liberty, it was the Israelis. It's quite well known now that Israel had been attempting to complete its first nuclear weapon at Dimona, their secret nuclear weapons plant, in the Negev desert. By the summer of 1967, the CIA had intelligence that a bomb was near completion. As your ship neared its position, I now can say that this nuclear weapon was ready to be detonated. you were going to be in the fallout zone of where the bomb was going to go off. And it nearly did go off. There were teams in Israel ready to fly in helicopters with this device and detonate it in place. It was a suicide mission because they didn't have timing mechanisms for the bomb. They had to run a very long wire, nearly a mile, to a detonator and set it off themselves. And of course, being a mile from a bomb like that was likely to end in their deaths. Again, it's got shades of Dr. Strangelove. One of the brave volunteers who was due to go on the mission has spoken to me in detail, and he had something to say. This man understood that the bomb was going to be detonated on a mountain in the Sinai Desert. The operation to place a bomb in Egypt was called Operation Samson, which indicates it was a sort of suicide mission, a last-ditch measure. And some of these people have indicated that the Americans knew about it, that they knew what Israel was up to. We must consider whether this was another reason why USS Liberty was sent close to the proposed blast area. Or is it just a bizarre coincidence? I doubt it. It is no exaggeration to say that we were close to World War III. America's Strategic Air Command was controlled from a huge underground nerve center in Arizona. Its role was to launch a nuclear blitzkrieg on Russia and China. Its primary means of doing that were B-52 nuclear-armed bombers. Before the Liberty attack, these bombers were put on high alert. I interviewed a pilot of a B-52 who was on high alert in California, and he was placed in that position before the Liberty attack. We also know that in Arizona, at SAC headquarters, similar measures were in place. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the involvement of the SAC suggests that other countries should well have known what was going on, because launching a nuclear war involved NATO. And the involvement of SAC suggests America and Israel were not the only countries that might have been involved in events of that period. SAC was, of course, hooked into NATO, which was based in Europe. NATO was led by an American General Lemnitzer, who also had a second job, which was being in charge of US forces in Europe, including the Mediterranean. These countries, members of NATO, probably knew something about this emergency and are also holding secrets about the Six-Day War. Britain was in a perfect position to keep an eye on what was going on. It had amazing electronic listening facilities in Cyprus. One crucial piece of evidence came to me recently, and that is that a squadron of Lightning aircraft, which were trained and designed to counter a Soviet nuclear attack, were on high alert in Cyprus for the whole duration of the Six-Day War. So what did Britain know about the Six-Day War that they've never told us about? Further supporting evidence is that British intelligence agents were working alongside American personnel in Israel as part of Operation Sinai in 1966, planning the war against Egypt. How do I know this? I have interviewed people who were there who confirm it. This is such a complex story. It is understandable we are still searching for answers. But even after more than 50 years, it is vitally important that we keep searching, not just from a historical perspective, but because it still has a bearing on modern world problems, not least the Palestinian problem. I want to end with another story. In the early 60s, long before the Six-Day War, a plan called Operation Northwards was drawn up by the Pentagon. The idea was to blacken the character of Fidel Castro, label the country, Cuba, as an aggressor, and create a casus belli, a justification for America launching an attack on the country. When Operation Northwards was brought to Kennedy in the Oval Office, he was horrified. It had numerous black ops that he strongly disapproved of. The man who brought that plan to him was General Lyman Lemnitzer, the guy who was in charge of US forces in Europe during the Six-Day War. Kennedy was so furious that within months he had Lemnitzer dispatched to Europe. He considered him to be a highly dangerous man. He was a hawk, virulently anti-communist, and prepared to do almost anything to get rid of the Soviet Union, including launch a nuclear war. The Northwoods Plan proposed many provocations, but one in particular is relevant. It recommended that an American ship should be sailed into Havana harbor where it would blow up. This would then be blamed on Cuba, giving an excuse to America to invade. The idea, as far as the Joint Chiefs of Staff were concerned, and Lemnitzer in particular, the use of nukes were not off the agenda in that eventuality. We therefore must ask whether the attack on the Liberty was modelled on these sort of dirty tricks, tactics, because they are so similar in terms of the detail. You only have to see what has been happening in Gaza in the last month to see that what happened in the Six-Day War has had ramifications all through the decades. The plight of the Palestinians is still the same. The story has not yet ended.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war.
Robert Kennedy had infuriated Zionist leaders by supporting an investigation aimed at registering the American Zionist Council as a foreign agent, which would have considerably hindered its efficiency. After the assassination of John Kennedy, the American Zionist Council escaped this procedure, and its lobbying division, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, became the most powerful lobby in the United States and an indispensable instrument for the corruption and intimidation of American elected officials and for the control of American foreign policy.
When he ran for president in 1968, Senator Kennedy planned to reopen the investigation into JFK's assassination, which would have exposed both the CIA and Israel's role, as well as their collaboration with LBJ in the false flag attack on the USS Liberty in 1967.
They had no other option but to stop him.
What has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, we can start to work together. We are a great country and a compassionate country, and I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next few months. Now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m.
The CIA and Zionists chose to falsely blame the assassination of Robert Kennedy on Palestinian-American Sirhan Sirhan, who could not possibly have fired the fatal shots that killed RFK. They selected Sirhan as their brainwashed scapegoat in order to stir up hatred and loathing of Palestinians and increase American support for Israel. Zionist fingerprints are once again found on the RFK assassination. James Jesus Angleton reportedly kept RFK autopsy photos in his safe as if they were some sort of memento or trophy. Both Lisa Peace and David Talbot named CIA agent Robert Mayhew as the orchestrator of the RFK assassination. Mayhew's close friend and notorious Zionist gunrunner Hank Greenspun bylined preposterous false trail stories in his Las Vegas Sun newspaper, claiming that Fidel Castro was responsible for both Kennedy assassinations. Yet another lie in Angleton's wilderness of mirrors.
He called me up one night and he said,
I've been thinking a lot about great men. It occurs to me that it would be kind of a cakewalk for me to become a great man. I mean, everybody expects me to be a great man. I'm perfectly positioned. I can just do it. And he said, but I've been reading a lot of biographies of great men all the way through history. And I'm realizing that not one of them seems to have been a good guy at home. And I wonder if it wouldn't be a much more interesting challenge in my position to set out at this point and see if I couldn't make myself a good man.
JFK Jr. was widely known to be planning to run for office, most likely for Senate in November of 2000. The CIA and the Mossad couldn't let him anywhere near elected office because he would obviously make it his unyielding mission to uncover the full truth about the assassinations of his uncle and his father. JFK Jr. published an issue of George magazine focused on analyzing conspiracies. One of the stories Kennedy published indicated an Israeli intelligence role in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who had softened his attitude toward the Palestinians. Netanyahu also had played an obvious and very public role in the Rabin assassination. The Mossad could not tolerate a high-profile Kennedy digging up dirt on Israel, which, if it had been exposed at that time, could possibly have caused a near disintegration of Israeli society.
4 eyewitnesses at Caldwell Airport saw former President George H.W. Bush and his son, Texas Governor George W. Bush, with 2 members of the Mossad, Michael Harari and General Raphael Eltan, the day before the tragic flight.
Good evening. Divers today found the bodies of John Kennedy, his wife, and her sister in the wreckage of his plane at the bottom of the ocean off Martha's Vineyard. In a day of fast-breaking developments, recovery teams got to work retrieving remains and wreckage. A memorial mass was set for Friday in New York. The President and the First Lady will be there. And the Kennedy family made plans for a possible burial at sea.
Less than 2 months before the JFK Jr. assassination, CBS, which is a CIA and Zionist affiliate, published a story about his father's coffin being dumped at sea, which was likely predictive programming and an announcement about what they planned to do to JFK Jr. The humiliation ritual was clear in the claim that Bobby Kennedy wanted his brother's coffin dumped at sea, and Bobby would have wanted to retain all physical evidence related to the crime in order to eventually prove that there was, in fact, a vast conspiracy.
In the next instant, with this time Mrs. Kennedy apparently looking on, a second shot, the third total shot, hit the President's head. His head could be seen to move violently forward.
We will know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false, CIA Director William Casey said in February 1981.
We talked for a long time on the phone, about 2 weeks before he died. I said, "You remember that conversation we had about being a good man?" And he said, "Of course, I think about it a lot." And I said, "Well, I just want you to know that you have wildly, spectacularly achieved that objective. I mean, you are as good a man as I know. You are as clear a case of what I consider to be virtue in an adult male that I can think of."
The cabal had to take him out, both to keep the secrets of their past crimes hidden and make sure JFK Jr. was not in a position of power to disrupt future crimes, such as 9/11.
What happened in 1977 was that Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, the former heads of the Zionist terrorist gang, the Irgun, and Lehi, the Stern gang, these 2 parties had created a coalition of all their former terrorist buddies and Netanyahu's in there, the revisionist Zionists. They came to power in Israel, and this is when the plan for 9/11 began. Menachem Begin is known as the father of terrorism. He's the founder of the Likud party. He was born in Russia, came to Palestine in 42, became leader of the Irgun in 44, which was a terrorist group, bombed the King David Hotel, killing 93 people, British headquarters in 1946, then was involved in the massacre of the Deir Yassin village, which was meant to scare the Palestinians to fleeing, which many did. And he created the Likud party in 1973, became prime minister in 77, and promptly invaded Lebanon in 1978. This is the emblem of the Irgun, which he was the head of. It's a Jewish terrorist group, and it's connected to the Netanyahu family because Mr. Netanyahu's father was the director of this movement, the Irgun, the new Zionist organization, since 1940. Here is both Mr. Begin and Netanyahu. These men are cut from the same cloth. This is the group that they belong to, the great group that they have allegiance to is a group of terrorists. In 1974, a British journalist asked Mr. Begin, he said, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be seen as the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin said, in the Middle East? He said, in all the world. So he put on himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. And in 1979, this man, Bibi Netanyahu, he'd been working in Boston for a Rothschild company called Boston Consulting Group. He went back, this is his father, and they started something called the Netanyahu Institute, in which they began promoting the idea of terrorism being the scourge that the West has to fight. And they had a conference in 1979 called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism. And George Bush spoke at the conference and spoke in support of this preemptive strikes against nations that are supporting terrorism.
Nach diesem ersten Teil des Films und einem riesigen Dankeschön an den Produzenten des Films blenden wir neben mir mal ein, was Helmut Schmidt, der deutsche Bundeskanzler von 1974 bis 1982 in einem Zeitinterview sagte. Er sprach den Satz: Sie werden übertroffen von bestimmten Formen von Staatsterrorismus. Von bestimmten Formen von Staatsterrorismus. Die Zeit fragt ihn dann, ist das Ihr Ernst? Wen meinen Sie? Und Schmidt sagt dann, belassen wir es dabei, aber ich meine wirklich, was ich sage. Ich führe dann in meinem Buch aus, welcher Staatsterrorismus welchen Landes von Helmut Schmidt nach meiner festen Überzeugung gemeint war. Lest es selbst neben mir. Und es war dieser Bundeskanzler Helmut Schmidt, der sagte, die deutsche Außenpolitik der 90er Jahre, meinte der Kanzler, dürfe nicht von Auschwitz überschattet werden. Da wird ja gerade ein Jahrestag begangen. Und heute ist es wohl um die deutsche Außenpolitik ganz anders bestellt, als Helmut Schmidt damals mahnte. Und dann schreibe ich in meinem Buch, Helmut Schmidt löste 1981 einen heftigen Streit mit dem damaligen israelischen Ministerpräsidenten Begin aus. Im folgenden Jahr 1982 wurde er abgewählt. Begin, fällt da der Groschen bei euch? Heftiger Streit mit Begin, der Mann, der am Ende des Films gerade ins rechte Licht gerückt wurde. Nun die Seiten des Kapitels 4 meines neuen und letzten Buchs Die große Täuschung über John F. Kennedy. Nutzt die Standbildfunktion bitte. Das nächste Video erst in 2 Wochen. Versteht bitte, was hier läuft und was euch alle bedroht. Alles Gute, Gottes Segen, gelobt sei Jesus Christus. Euer Thorsten Schulte, in 2 Wochen sehen wir uns wieder.